It's best known for being introduced by the Soviet Union, but in reality, the SKS-45 and its variants saw greater use elsewhere. Among them was the People's Republic of China. Today, a short and convoluted history of the Type 56 carbine. Redneck Preppy here. Today we're going to take a brief tour of the history of the SKS-45. Well, kind of. Actually, the 56 Shiban Jidong Bukeng, or Type 56 semi-automatic rifle, as it was known to China, or Type 56 carbine for the rest of us. Now, I'm going to dispense discussing the early history of the SKS-45, particularly in Soviet hands, as I've covered it in other videos. Rather, today I'm going to explore the use of the Type 56 carbine in China. As always with these short and convoluted series, please consider this an introduction, not a comprehensive history. Now, before we begin, just a note. The Chinese military, like many, incorporated the year of introduction into official designations of a military firearm. In 1956, they introduced 3 different platforms that have all been dubbed Type 56. You have the Type 56 carbine, which is, of course, their version of the SKS-45. There's the Type 56 assault rifle, their take on the AK-47. And finally, there's the Type 56M, or 56-5, which is the RPK-style light machine gun. To avoid confusion, I'm going to be calling it the Type 56 carbine, or the carbine. As with many nations post-Second World War, China exited that conflict largely armed with bolt-action rifles, including the Japanese Type 38 Arisaka, and was eager to enter the modern age. Now, after Mao's communists took over, they naturally looked to their ideological ally in the Soviet Union and were interested in their shiny new toys. The Soviets were happy not only to transfer the technical package for the AK-47, but also the stillborn SKS-45, a rifle that they had recently ended production of. It wasn't the AK, but in the eyes of the Chinese, the carbine had a pair of superb attributes. It was rugged and simple. Given that the mass of the Chinese army was largely composed of uneducated peasants, those were key points in its favor. So the Soviets wrapped up tooling, machinery, and leftover parts for the SKS-45 and shipped it off to China along with a host of experts. In 1956, production began at the Jiangxi Machine Tool Factory in Chongqing, known to military surplus collectors as Arsenal 26. Experts consider the early rifles, about 2,000, that were produced at the plant to be Sino-Soviet rifles. That is, while Chinese workers produced the rifles, it was under Soviet oversight and with Soviet parts, including receivers that were still marked with the Tula production plant symbol. It's believed that most of those Sino-Soviet rifles were manufactured in 1956, and the last Soviet parts were used up the following year. Now, these rifles didn't have the Arsenal 26 mark associated with Jiangxi. That didn't start appearing on rifles until April 1957. Cooperation between the Soviets and China continued until the early 1960s, when ideological differences caused the Sino-Soviet split, apparently sparked by Khrushchev's anti-Stalinist path. In 1960, the Soviets withdrew all of their technical advisors, and as a result, Arsenal 26, if it wasn't already, was now a purely Chinese concern. Now, the Chinese were, and perhaps even are, inveterate tinkerers with every rifle they adopted, and the Type 56 carbine was no exception. Although initial production hewed very closely to the Soviet design, Over the following years, they experimented with a number of changes. Some of them were very small, like changing the type of thumb rest on the takedown lever, while others were a bit more substantial, such as producing partially or fully stamped receivers instead of the exclusively milled design that the Soviets had employed. And speaking of stamped receivers, they even produced a limited run of stamped sheet metal receivers. Other changes included a long barrel lug introduced in 1961, which was then changed in 1964 to a short barrel lug. Stamped trigger groups came in 1966. One very noticeable change, the Type 56 carbine, was initially manufactured with a blade bayonet. In the middle of 1964, the Chinese made the switch to the spike bayonet we typically associate with the rifle. Carbines with serial numbers below 9 million have the blade folding bayonet, while those 9 million and higher have the spike folding bayonet. The experimentation and revisions were such that carbines produced at the same factory within a relatively short period of time could have notable differences between them. Sometime in the late 1960s, additional factories began producing the rifle, but we don't know which or how many, though we have evidence of over 100 different arsenal markings on carbines. From what I've found through research, those other factories tended to follow whatever design Arsenal 26 was using. Production of the Type 56 carbine continued until 1980. Now, normally at this point, I'd tell you how many rifles were made, but we don't actually know. The Chinese aren't particularly forthcoming about military production numbers. We do know that by about 1960, they had manufactured in the neighborhood of 1 million carbines, but any number after that would be nothing but a guess, though I have seen an estimate of 18 million being produced ultimately. You might be wondering, if the Chinese had the Type 56 assault rifle, was the Type 56 carbine then relegated to a second or third line role? And the answer is no. Both rifles actually serve side by side. According to my research, the average People's Liberation Army battalion actually had more carbines with 360 than assault rifles at 220. And this practice continued essentially for decades, with both seeing active combat during the 1960s border skirmishes with the Soviets, as well as the Sino-Vietnamese War in 1979, where both sides were armed with Chinese-made Type 56 carbines. Now, although the Chinese were generally pleased by the carbine, that didn't stop them from trying to replace it. One of the contenders was the Type 63 assault rifle. Now, based on its appearance, many people believe that it's based on the Type 56 carbine purely due to their resemblance. But the Type 63 is arguably based more on the Type 56 assault rifle. Either way, it was a colossal failure and was officially retired in 1978, wildly hated by those who had to carry it. And it was outlived by the humble carbine it actually tried to supplant. The carbine survived in Chinese service until 1985, when it was finally retired. It was replaced by the Type 81 assault rifle, a platform which is a blend of AK, Dragunov, and the SKS, which then served alongside the Type 56 assault rifle. Perhaps not surprisingly, the Chinese exported the rifle to a number of allied nations and movements around the world. The most notable user was probably North Vietnam, where the Viet Cong tended to be armed with the Type 56 carbine, while the professional NVA generally received AK-47s or Type 56 assault rifles. Indeed, so many Type 56 carbines were shipped to the North Vietnamese that reportedly most non-commercial Type 56 carbines in the United States today were actually brought back by American soldiers as prizes during the Vietnam War. Now, outside of North Vietnam, the Chinese shipped the carbine to other countries and communist movements, which included places like Asia and Africa, including Angola. China also supplied Syria and the Palestine Liberation Organization with the Type 56 carbine several times in the mid to late 1960s, some of which were subsequently captured by Israel in 1982 when they invaded southern Lebanon. You can actually find many of those rifles in the United States after they were imported by Century Arms International. Take a close look at your Type 56 carbine. You might actually have something different there. If you know military surplus, you know that the SKS-45 and its variants, which of course includes the Type 56 carbine, are among the most popular collector's items in those circles. After the rifle finished military service in China and was surplused out to the world, commercial production began in 1984, and exports were made to many countries, including the United States, well, at least until 1994, and Canada. There have been a pile of commercial variants made in China, including 1988 models that were converted to accept AK pattern magazines. There were sporter versions, one with a longer barrel, another with a Monte Carlo stock. There are many different commercial variants and a bit outside the parameters of this video, since we're more interested in the military version. Now, as for military use, given that the rifle was exported to a number of nations over the decades, you probably shouldn't be too surprised to know that they continue to float around various hot spots and war zones, including the Middle East and Africa. However, most nations which had them in service have either sold them off as surplus, stuck them in a warehouse to be forgotten, or relegated them to ceremonial duty. Many users of the Type 56 carbine these days are, well, terrorist groups and irregular armies that may have received these rifles decades ago and just continue to make use of them. In China, it's still used by reserve units and the militia, and it's also employed as a ceremonial weapon by the Chinese military. So what is the legacy of the Chinese variant of the SKS-45? Some would argue because it saw more battlefield action in Chinese hands. It was the primary firearm of China and Vietnam in several wars, so that makes it more relevant to military history than the SKS. In reality, I think it's a bit of a mug's game to try and make that call. The SKS-45 has also seen plenty of action, if not in the hands of Soviet soldiers, at least in the hands of their nation-state and revolutionary comrades around the world. Heck, I've seen recent pictures of people armed with the SKS in the ongoing war in Ukraine. So it might resonate slightly more with Americans because they went up against Vietnamese troops armed with the Type 56 carbine. But honestly, I think it's a wash as to importance to history. Now, in the Soviet Union, the SKS-45 was essentially an evolutionary dead end, obviously because the AK platform has informed most Soviet and Russian designs since. It's not much different in China, though to hear some people talk, half of all rifles designed there since 1956 were based off the Type 56 carbine. In reality, you can make a small case for the Type 63 assault rifle, which at least had elements of the SKS-45, though its rotating bolt system was taken from the AK platform. You could perhaps include the Type 81 assault rifle, which was ostensibly an improved version of the Type 63, but again, same deal. Personally, I would argue that if the Type 56 carbine inspired anything, it was the manufacture of other SKS carbines, such as in Albania or in Bangladesh, where it was manufactured under license from the Chinese until 2006. At the end of the day, it was a design which, granted, did last longer in China than the Soviet Union, but it also had no great effect on firearms design. That said, I'm in the same space about the Type 56 carbine as the SKS-45, although this is hobbled by semi-automatic fire and a 10-round magazine. It's a simple and reliable firearm. One could debate the Chinese doctrine of employing the carbine as a standard service rifle and the assault rifle as an officer's weapon, akin to the old Soviet doctrine of the AK as submachine gun. But for the needs of an uneducated army that needed to arm a lot of soldiers, it was a reasonable choice. If you're interested in going deeper down the Type 56 carbine rabbit hole, there's an excellent website for you to check out called Chinese SKS Guide. There's a link in the description below. At any rate, I hope you found today's video at least be vaguely entertaining and mildly informative. As always, have yourself a great day. Take care, and bye-bye.